Chapter 16. Whose Country? Oldcomers and Newcomers. America's cities and factories bulged with people. Some had come from the quiet American countryside. Others had been peasants in Europe and come across the ocean with high hopes. All of them had been told that everyone could succeed in America. All you had to do was be honest and work hard. But many honest, hard-working immigrants found that they could not get ahead, and these disappointed Americans were not willing to take their disappointments lying down. The United States was the land of help yourself. It is not surprising, then, that the post-Civil War years became a time of conflict. Working men began organizing in labor unions. Their aim was a better life, shorter hours, higher wages, but peaceful means did not always seem strong enough. Beginning in the 1870s, labor battles became more common. In 1872, nearly 100,000 builders and mechanics went on strike in New York. They refused to work longer than 8 hours in any one day. After several months, they won their point. Miners in the eastern Pennsylvania coal fields organized a secret society. They called themselves the Molly Maguires. In 1875, 10 of them were hanged for murder. Private detectives hired by the employers had put together the case against them. Then in 1877, workers on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad struck. Their work stoppage soon spread across the country. In West Virginia, 9 people died as a result of the strike. In Pittsburgh, 26 died. In 1886, the so-called Haymarket Massacre occurred in Chicago. When police tried to break up a meeting of anarchists and communists, someone exploded a bomb. 7 policemen died and 70 others were wounded. In 1892, during a fight at the steelworks at Homestead, Pennsylvania, 7 men died. The Pullman strike of 1894 again tied up the railroads, and the strike became a minor civil war when federal troops began fighting against workers. A conservative and law-abiding organization of trade unions, the American Federation of Labor became strong among skilled workers. The Federation's aim was simply better wages and shorter hours. Meanwhile, a small number of radicals called Wobblies, who aimed to take the factories away from their owners, started the International Workers of the World. All over the country, crime showed an alarming increase. In 1890, the prisons held 50% more criminals than 10 years before, and the murder rate in the United States, already twice the rate in England or in Germany, went up every year. National crime rings used hideouts in Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, and scores of other cities to help their members escape the police. The city crowds at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876, at the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893, and every day on streetcars or in department stores were a pickpocket's paradise. Young hoodlums terrorized San Francisco with knives and 6-shooters. People invented new expressions to describe these new criminals. They were badger game experts and knockout drop artists. Green goods men tricked innocent farmers into exchanging their real money for large bundles of counterfeit money. In 1880, one go-getting criminal from Springfield, Illinois, went to New York where he made a fortune selling gold bricks. Before a fellow thief killed him, he took in over $250,000 by selling to gullible country boys lead bricks that he had painted gold. A ring working out of New York managed one of the biggest bank robberies in history. In 1878, from a single job they had planned for 3 years, they got $3 million. Stores with fancy goods on display naturally attracted shoplifters. Meanwhile, newspapers, anxious to sell more copies so they could attract more advertising, became more sensational than ever. They found that it paid to feature the worst crimes and to glamorize the worst criminals. In business and in government, too, there were notorious scandals. Beginning soon after the Civil War, President Grant made a bad start. He was so honest himself that he did not know a crook when he saw one. Some found their way into his cabinet, and then used their position in the government to make a fortune for their railroads on their banks. All decent Americans had reason to be worried. Was this the best they could expect from what Jefferson had so hopefully called an empire for liberty? The early American frontier had been a line on the outer edge of settlements. Beyond was the no man's land where Indians had not yet given up and where settlers had not yet conquered. Out there, a man could make a fresh start. In the centennial year of 1876, the defeat of Chief Sitting Bull and Chief Crazy Horse and their braves marked the last great battle between the Indians and the invading settlers. 15 years later, the superintendent of the census reported that there was no more wilderness frontier. By the end of the 1800s, then, the New World had lost much of its newness. One bright young historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, proposed the theory that the end of the frontier explained many of the country's troubles. According to Turner, what had made America the land of promise was not its cities, but its frontier. The free land out west, he explained, had also been a safety valve. In earlier times, if a man in Eastern Europe or in an eastern city wanted a second chance, he could move to the west. But now that the country was filling up, it was no longer possible to find your second chance by going out to the edge of civilization. If you were unlucky enough to be a newcomer in a slum, there seemed to be no escape. Was it surprising then that so many Americans were unhappy and that so many felt that they had to fight for a better life? For a while it seemed that the country might be divided between old-comers and newcomers. Old-comers themselves, of course, came from immigrant families originally, but their families had been in America for a long time. Among them were the rich and famous. Few were crowded into slums. The old-comers were in charge in the older eastern states. Those states still controlled Congress. Most of the people with money, education, and power were old-comers. But the old-comers did not agree on how to cure the country's ills. Some were simply frightened. They wanted to keep the country the way it was. They blamed all the troubles on the newcomers. Their answer was to slam the door on more people. Simply because their families had been here longer, they thought that the whole nation belonged to them. At Harvard College, a group of New England blue bloods thought their world was coming to an end. Some of the professors taught that there was an Anglo-Saxon race superior to all others. This race, they said, was separated from others not by color, but by what countries the people had come from. The superior people came from England and Germany. 3 young men in the graduating class of 1889, Charles Warren, Robert de Courcy Ward, and Prescott Farnsworth Hall, took these lessons to heart. They had been raised near Boston, but they realized that their families came from England and Germany. Their parents were horrified by the hordes of vulgar immigrants, and especially by those with unfamiliar ways, from Ireland and from southern and eastern Europe. The solution to the nation's problems, they said, was to keep out all people who were not like themselves. 5 years after graduating from college, then, Warren, Ward, and Hall formed the Immigration Restriction League. They determined to persuade Congress to pass laws that would keep out all undesirable immigrants, the newcomers. These new immigrants, they argued, were the main cause of the increasing crime, the strikes, and most of the troubles of the country. To keep out undesirables, they proposed a literacy test. According to the proposed law, if you were more than 14 years old and wanted to come into the United States, you would have to prove you could read and write. You did not have to know English, but you had to be able to read and write the language of the country from which you came. At first sight, the test seemed harmless enough, but it was aimed against the newcomers from certain countries. For example, poor peasants from Italy and Greece had no chance to go to school. The Boston Blue Bloods believed that because newcomers from such countries were not Anglo-Saxons, they must be inferior. But they did not dare list particular countries in their proposed law. Many people already in the United States came from those countries. They would be insulted, and they too elected members of Congress. Year after year, the Immigration Restriction League tried to persuade Congress to pass a literacy test. But even then, when they finally pushed their bill through Congress, they did not manage to make it into a law. One president after another vetoed the bill. President Grover Cleveland called the law underhanded because it did not say what it really meant. And President William Howard Taft said the United States needed the labor of all immigrants and should teach them to read. President Woodrow Wilson agreed. All three presidents said the law was un-American. The United States had always been a nation of nations. It made no sense to keep people out because they were oppressed. America had always been a haven for the oppressed. It was in America that the starving could find bread and the illiterate could learn to read. In 1917, however, the war in Europe frightened Americans. They were so afraid that even though President Wilson vetoed the bill twice, it had enough votes in Congress to pass, even over his veto. Out on the West Coast, old comers and newcomers from Asia, or were out on the West Coast, old comers feared newcomers from Asia. They worried about hordes that might come across the Pacific, and they had persuaded Congress to pass a Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Then, in 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt persuaded the Japanese government to stop their people from emigrating. For some odd reason, they called it a gentleman's agreement. This became the slang expression for any agreement to discriminate against people because of their race, when you were ashamed to admit what you were really doing. Since there were so few Chinese American and Japanese American voters among the newcomers, the fearful few among the old comers found it easier to have their way.